March 15, 1852, St. Louis Cathedral, New Orleans. The wedding guests never forgot the scream. It began like any other union of New Orleans' finest, grandiose, solemn, dazzling with imported silk and gilded crucifixes, while the scent of magnolia drifted through the stained-glass shadows. The Callahans, newly settled from County Cork, were nervous but proud. The Browns, or rather, Margaret Brown, watched with frozen grace from the front pew, her gloved fingers resting like spider legs upon her lap. Her son, Thomas, 24 and golden-haired as a prince in a fable, stood beaming beneath the vaulted dome. And then the bride took the wine. A delicate sip from the ceremonial chalice, as custom dictated. A brief silence. Then came the choking, the convulsion, the foam bubbling over her lips like sea scum upon marble. Her veil slid sideways. She whispered, hoarse and rasping, "The wine burns," before collapsing against her groom's chest. Screams followed, not just one, but a wave of them, like doves startled in a cathedral dome. The wedding became a waking nightmare in seconds. Gilded fans fell to the marble floor. Men shouted for the doctor. A priest dropped to his knees, clutching the crucifix. And Thomas, poor, stunned Thomas, looked down at the woman he loved, now writhing in his arms, her white gown already marked with bile and blood. No one noticed the mother of the groom slip out the side door. New Orleans in 1852 was a city on the edge of itself, thriving, swollen with trade and immigrants, yet decaying at the corners like an overripe peach. The Mississippi carried not only sugar and cotton but disease, rumors, and secrets. French, Spanish, Creole, Irish, they all walked the same muddy streets, side by side, never truly together. It was a city of smells. Molasses and sewage. Jasmine and powder. The perfume of wealth, and the rot beneath it. To walk through the Vieux that spring was to feel history pressing against your skin, the slave auction still humming in hushed corners, the opera house echoing with Bizet, and the flick of a gambler's card echoing in smoky taverns near the port. Above it all, the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis stood like a white ghost, watching the living pass through their rituals and vices. Thomas Brown had been born into this contradiction. The only son of Robert Brown, a late shipping magnate who once ran 5 steamers from New Orleans to Havana, and Margaret Wexley Brown, the iron-willed daughter of a Louisiana judge, Thomas was expected to inherit not only wealth but position. After Robert's death from yellow fever in 1848, Margaret kept the empire afloat, and expanded it. She wore black from the day of her husband's burial, and never remarried. People in the Garden District whispered that Margaret had a tongue sharper than any blade, and a memory longer than a courtroom docket. She donated to St. Alphonsus, hosted only 2 galas a year, and expected her son to marry a girl with lineage, land, and decorum. Preferably all 3. Mary Callahan had none of these. She was the daughter of Patrick Callahan, a dockworker from County Cork who'd come to New Orleans aboard the brig Fiona in 1849, escaping the hunger and graveyards of the Irish famine. The Callahans rented 2 rooms in a boarding house on St. Claude Street, alongside grocers, laborers, and seamstresses. Patrick was known for his fists, his debts, and his songs, and he worked on the very docks that once bore crates marked Brown Shipping and Company. Mary, his only child, was educated by nuns at St. Mary's Orphan Asylum thanks to a favor from a merchant's wife whose baby she had nursed back to health. By 18, she had found employment as a clerk in a French Quarter apothecary, where she transcribed prescriptions in her careful, curling script. That was where Thomas first saw her, not in a ballroom, but among glass bottles and chalk dust. He had come seeking a tincture for his mother's sleep. He left with his heart altered. Their courtship, once Beg*N, was brief and electric. Walks near Esplanade Avenue. Letters passed through laundry boys. Meetings at dawn near the levee, where the fog softened the world enough to allow love between 2 castes. Mary's voice was soft but certain. She laughed rarely, but when she did, it lit something in Thomas no debutante's flirtation ever had. When Margaret found out, it was not through gossip, but through an invoice. She discovered Mary's name on a shipping ledger folded among Thomas's correspondence. For Miss M. Callahan, lavender oil, pennyroyal, laudanum. A lady's signature, and her son's expensive taste. At dinner that evening, Margaret passed the roastock without comment and then, in her slow, deliberate drawl, said, "Thomas, are you planning to disgrace the family in print?" The war had begged *n. Margaret tried every tool in her arsenal. First came charm. She offered her son a voyage to Florence, to see the Botticellis he'd studied in school. When he refused, she tried legal fire, a reminder that the estate had never formally passed to him, and could still be divided. When this, too, failed to dislodge him, she went to the dockyards. She found Patrick Callahan after a shift, still smelling of sweat and tar. The conversation, held behind a stack of barrels, was not recorded, but rumors say she offered him $200 to persuade Mary to disappear. A fortune to a man with gambling debts. But Patrick spat at her feet. "She's no one's to sell, madam," he said. Humiliated, Margaret's fury turned private and cold. She refused to acknowledge the engagement when it was announced in the Times-Picayune on February 12. Her reply, when asked by friends if she would attend, was simply, "I will be present." She made no effort to meet the Callahans. She sent no gift. And yet she remained still as a statue in court. It was then, sometime in the final weeks before the wedding, that Margaret Brown began to frequent a certain shop on Royal Street, a dim, narrow place nestled between a pawnshop and a voodoo parlor. Its proprietor was not a pharmacist in the modern sense. He was a chemist of old French extraction, who had once studied in Lyon and lost his license in a scandal involving mercury and a corset-maker's miscarriage. His shop sold patent remedies, dried herbs, and powders for female complaints. It also sold more dangerous substances, for those who knew how to ask. It is not clear exactly what Margaret said that day, nor how much money she laid down, but a ledger found years later included a single, chilling line. March 2nd, Madam B. For sleep of peace, 1 dram phosphorus sublime. Paid in coin. Warned of fumes. White phosphorus. A deadly powder. Colorless, odorless, and easily dissolved in wine. In the days leading up to the wedding, preparations were simple but elegant. The Callahans, grateful and nervous, insisted on paying for their daughter's modest veil and gloves. Thomas purchased a custom lace handkerchief embroidered with Mary's initials, a symbol, he said, of starting life with her name in my hand. The church was to supply the ceremonial chalice and wine. What no one noticed was that Margaret, days before the ceremony, visited the vestry with a small silver bottle, claiming to donate a fine vintage from her family's private collection. "A gift for the sacrament," she said. The priest, overwhelmed by Easter preparations and distracted by a delivery of palms, accepted the bottle without suspicion and placed it in the sacristy cabinet, among other ceremonial items. That bottle would reappear on March 15th, at the altar of St. Louis Cathedral, chilled slightly, and decanted into the wedding chalice. The same chalice from which Mary Callahan would take her fatal sip. The same sip Thomas Brown would share. The bells of St. Louis Cathedral rang clear and golden that morning, summoning half the quarter to witness the unlikely union. Irish dockworkers in their Sunday coats stood shoulder to shoulder with sugar merchants in silk waistcoats. The Callahans had invited half their parish, while the Browns' circle of respectability filled the other pews with stony faces. High society came not to bless the marriage, but to watch it falter. Mary Callahan, radiant in her modest gown of cream muslin trimmed with borrowed lace, walked the aisle with her father at her side. The stained glass poured rubies and sapphires across her veil, and the smell of incense rose like a curtain between worlds. She looked fragile, yes, but alive with quiet strength. Some whispered she looked too pale, others whispered she looked too perfect. Thomas Brown, tall and resolute, never removed his gaze from her as she approached. For a brief moment, the entire cathedral seemed to soften, the gulf between classes, the resentment of Margaret, the whispers of disapproval, all vanished in the tremor of that look between bride and groom. The priest, Father Gaspard Dupré, a Frenchman with snowy hair and a voice that carried like a trumpet, began the rite in solemn cadence. Rings were exchanged, vows spoken with trembling fervor. The congregation shifted, hushed, waiting for the climactic blessing, the wine of the sacrament, shared by bride and groom, sealing their union before God. A deacon brought forth the chalice, filled not from the parish's ordinary supply, but from the fine vintage Margaret Brown had donated days earlier. Its ruby surface gleamed in the candlelight, innocent, inviting. Mary's hands shook slightly as she lifted the chalice. She glanced once at Thomas, then raised it to her lips. A sip delicate, like the kiss of a flame. Then another. The first cough startled no one. The second silenced the pews. Then came the convulsion. She clutched her stomach, her face draining of blood. Her mouth foamed, the lace of her veil darkening with spit and bile. Her cry was strangled, but all who stood close heard the words. The wine burns. The chalice slipped from her hand and clattered against the marble, red wine spilling like blood across the floor. Gasps rippled through the church. A woman fainted. Father Dupré raised the crucifix, muttering prayers against sudden death. Guests surged forward, their finery collapsing into panic. Thomas caught his bride as she fell, pressing his hand against her trembling back. Mary! Mary, stay with me! His own lips, still wet from the kiss he had given her moments before, brushed the rim of the chalice. In the confusion, no one noticed that he, too, had sipped. The realization came too late. His knees buckled. His face contorted in agony, and he collapsed beside Mary, writhing in mirrored torment. A double cry went up from the congregation, horror multiplied, as though the cathedral itself had been struck by lightning. At that instant one man moved with clarity while the rest froze. Jean Duval, a visiting physician from Paris known in the city for his lectures on toxicology, leapt from his seat. He pushed through the crowd, his black frock coat flaring like wings. "Clear the air! Open the doors!" he shouted, his French accent thick and commanding. "They are poisoned! Do not let them suffocate!" Two acolytes obeyed, flinging open the heavy oak doors so that fresh air and the distant clamor of the quarter rushed in. Duval knelt beside the bride, prying her jaw open with firm fingers, sniffing her breath. His face hardened. "Phosphor," he muttered. "Mon Dieu!" The words sent a ripple through the few who understood it. White phosphorus, a substance known to apothecaries, feared even by soldiers. It burned flesh from within, gnawed at the organs, left mouths glowing faintly in the dark. "Quickly!" Duval ordered. "Vinegar! Milk! Charcoal if you have it! Anything to bind the fire!" The sacristan rushed to the rectory pantry, returning with a jug of sour wine and a sack of ground charcoal meant for incense. Duval mixed them into a black slurry and forced it between Mary's clenched teeth. She gagged, coughed, expelled more foam. He repeated the process with Thomas, whose face had turned ashen, eyes rolling. The cathedral was pandemonium. Women sobbed into their gloves, men shouted at the priest, children were dragged out into the square. And all the while, in the front pew, Margaret Brown sat perfectly still, her veil untouched, her lips curved in the faintest line of composure. Some later swore they saw her hands tremble. Others said she looked serene, like a widow at a funeral she herself had planned. Mary's convulsions lessened. Thomas groaned, clutching his stomach but breathing. Duval wiped his hands on his kerchief, his brow dripping with sweat. "They may live," he declared, his voice hoarse. "But this is no accident. Someone has placed death in the cup of God." The priest, pale and trembling, ordered the remaining wine bottle brought forth. When the deacon lifted it into the light, all could see the glitter of white crystals clinging to the bottom, sharp as frost, unmistakable to any apothecary's eye. A murmur swelled like a storm tide. Poison. Poison at the altar. Duval's gaze swept the pews. "This was deliberate," he said. "Someone here intended to murder." And as the whispers rose, Mary, half conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding, lifted her trembling hand and pointed weakly toward the pew where Margaret Brown sat. Her voice, scarcely more than a sigh, carried just enough to be heard by those nearest. She touched the wine. The cathedral emptied in chaos. Carriages clattered down Chartres Street as guests fled, some crossing themselves, others swearing never to attend a Brown affair again. Yet a knot of witnesses remained inside: the priest, the physician, several guards from Jackson Square, and a handful of brave souls unwilling to let the matter dissolve into rumor. At the center lay the stricken couple. Mary, pale as wax, her chest rising in shallow, painful gasps. Thomas, his once proud shoulders shaking under the priest's hands. And beside them knelt Jean Duval, scribbling frantic notes in a pocketbook even as he demanded vinegar poultices and mustard draughts. He was a man at war with death, and he meant to leave a record of the battlefield. When the bottle was lifted for inspection, the crowd pressed forward. White grains glittered at the bottom like frost crystals, stubborn against the dark wine. Father Dupré lifted it toward the candlelight, his voice trembling. "This is the Lord's chalice. And it has been profaned." The word echoed. Profaned. A sacrilege and a crime. Eyes turned like compass needles toward Margaret Brown. She alone remained composed, her veil framing a face of marble stillness. "Are you suggesting," she asked, her voice calm as ice, "that I would defile God's altar at my own son's wedding?" Whispers rose, sharp, sibilant, dangerous. Duval closed his notebook with a snap. "The symptoms are unmistakable. I have seen this in Paris, in workers poisoned by phosphorus while making matches. Burning of the stomach, foaming of the lips, collapse within minutes. It is no illness of the blood, no weakness of constitution. It is deliberate." The guards exchanged glances. One, a broad-shouldered veteran named Rousseau, stepped forward. "Madam," he said gruffly, "you were seen near the sacristy before the ceremony. Is that true?" The question hung like a noose. Margaret's lips twitched. "I delivered a bottle, yes. A donation for the sacrament. From my husband's cellar. I thought it fitting. A gift," someone muttered darkly. "A widow's gift." Mary, stirred by the commotion, forced her cracked lips to move. "I saw her," she whispered. The words scraped her throat raw. "Near the table, when Father turned away." The priest's eyes widened. He recalled it now: a rustle of skirts in the vestry, a faint clink of glass, and Margaret's pale figure gliding past as he reached for the palms. At the time he thought nothing of it. Now the memory pressed against him like a confession of his own blindness. "Bring her out," Rousseau ordered. Two guards approached, hesitant, as though afraid of laying hands upon a woman of her station. But Margaret rose before they touched her. She stood tall, her black silk gown rustling like a funeral shroud. "You fools," she said quietly, so only those closest could hear. "Do you think I meant to harm him? My son?" Her eyes flicked toward Thomas, writhing on the marble. "It was her frailty that doomed them both." Gasps broke out. Admission, though twisted, hung in the air. Rousseau seized her arm. She did not resist. She merely turned to the congregation, her eyes glittering. "Out of love," she declared. "Out of love I acted. Would you let a Brown heir squander fortune and name on the daughter of a dock rat?" The silence that followed was heavier than any outcry. They led her from the cathedral, her heels striking stone with measured clicks. Outside, a mob had gathered, already swollen with rumor. The sight of Margaret Brown, veiled and flanked by guards, ignited them. Shouts filled the square: "Poisoner!" "Witch!" "Murderess!" Some threw clods of mud. Others crossed themselves and backed away as though she carried pestilence. In the rectory chamber, Mary was laid upon a cot, Thomas beside her. Duval worked tirelessly, administering draughts, coaxing them to vomit, wrapping them in blankets to drive out the cold sweat. He spoke little, except to mutter the same phrase again and again. "It may be too late, too late." Outside, the bells rang once more, not for celebration, but for alarm. News galloped faster than horses through the French Quarter. By dusk, every tavern from Canal Street to Esplanade buzzed with the tale of the poisoned wedding. By nightfall, the city papers had already prepared their broadsheets. "Scandal at the Cathedral." "Prominent widow arrested in plot to K*LL bride." "Society matron accused of sacrilege and poison." The Browns' mansion on Prytania Street shuttered its windows against stones and jeers. The Callahans' boarding house overflowed with mourners bringing soup, rosaries, and whispered prayers. And in the parish jail, Margaret Brown sat in her cell, hands folded, her lips moving silently in what she claimed were prayers, though one guard swore she smiled in the dark. The stage was set for a trial unlike any Louisiana had ever seen. The case of the state of Louisiana versus Margaret Wexley Brown opened on May 6, 1852, in the Orleans Parish Criminal Court. By then, the story had become more than local scandal. It was reported in Charleston, in Boston, even in Dublin, where Irish papers described it as the poisoned chalice of New Orleans. The courtroom overflowed. Merchants, dockworkers, planters, Creole widows, even newspapermen from as far as Philadelphia jostled for a glimpse of the woman accused of turning a wedding into a wake. The benches groaned under the press of bodies. Fans fluttered, hats bobbed, and the smell of sweat mingled with ink and cigar smoke. Margaret entered in widow's black, her veil lowered, walking with measured grace. She carried no Bible, no rosary, only her composure, as if dignity itself were her counsel. Yet beside her sat her attorney, Charles R. Destrehan, a man known for defending sugar barons and property disputes. His presence alone signaled that this would not be a quiet affair. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical cruelty. They produced the wine bottle, still bearing crystals of phosphorus at its base. They summoned the apothecary of Royal Street, who testified, reluctantly, that a Madam B. had purchased a dram of phosphorus powder 2 weeks before the wedding. His ledger bore the entry. His eyes darted nervously toward the defense table, but the ink on the page spoke louder than fear. Then came Father Dupré, his voice heavy with shame, describing how Margaret had donated the bottle, how she had lingered in the sacristy. His words trembled with both piety and regret. I failed to guard the chalice of the Lord. In my negligence, I permitted sacrilege. The most damning witness was Mary herself. Carried into the courtroom on a litter, her body weakened, her skin ashen, she spoke only a few sentences before collapsing again. But her words, whispered through cracked lips, struck like thunder. I saw her hand, at the bottle. I saw her pour. Gasps shook the room. Even Destrehan bowed his head. Margaret's defense was simple, almost pitiful in its repetition. She had acted out of love. I sought to protect my son, she told the jury, her voice even. I did not mean for him to drink. The girl was frail. It was her weakness that betrayed her. When asked if she regretted her act, she answered with chilling clarity. I regret only that he suffered. I do not regret preserving our name. The jury required less than 2 hours. Guilty, not of murder, but of attempted murder and sacrilege. The distinction saved her from the gallows. Instead, Judge Theodore Marchand pronounced, Margaret Wexley Brown, you are hereby sentenced to 20 years hard labor at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. May you find in toil the humility you lacked in society. Her veil never lifted. She bowed, turned, and walked from the courtroom as though leaving a soiree. For Thomas and Mary, the verdict came too late. Jean Duval's desperate remedies had saved their lives that night, but survival came at a price. Thomas, once vigorous, never regained his strength. He walked with a tremor, his complexion sallow, his breath shallow. The phosphorus had scarred his stomach and left his nerves ragged. Mary's condition worsened steadily. By midsummer she was bedridden, coughing blood, her body wasting. On August 3rd, she died in her husband's arms, whispering only his name. Her funeral, held in the same cathedral where she had collapsed, drew hundreds. Dockworkers marched in a silent line, their caps in hand. Women scattered violets on her coffin. Thomas, pale and hollow-eyed, stood alone at the graveside, his mother in prison, his bride in the earth. In September, unable to endure the city that had poisoned both his family and his future, Thomas left New Orleans. He sold what remained of the Brown estate, paid off his mother's debts, and boarded a packet ship for New York. There he studied law. By 1856, he was known in immigrant neighborhoods as a fierce advocate, defending Irish laborers beaten in the streets, Italians cheated of wages, Germans accused in riots. Perhaps I could not save her, he once wrote to a friend. But I will save those who are despised as she was. Margaret served 10 years before illness and influence won her a partial release. She died in obscurity, her name blackened, her wealth squandered on legal costs. Some whispered she never repented, that she died still insisting she had preserved the Browns' honor. Others said she called for Thomas with her last breath, but he never came. Thus ended what the newspapers christened the poisoned wedding of New Orleans. It lingered in memory not just as a crime of passion, but as a parable. Pride had turned a mother into a poisoner. Prejudice had made a marriage into scandal. And love, young, fragile love, had been the casualty. In the quarter, ballads were sung, of the bride who drank fire, the groom who fell beside her, and the mother who mistook control for devotion. Even now, in the shadow of the cathedral, guides lower their voices when recounting the tale. Here, they say, pointing to the marble floor, is where the chalice fell. And here, though you cannot see it, is where the wine still burns. The official records close with sentences and obituaries, with Margaret's conviction and Mary's death. But history, especially in New Orleans, does not end in ink. It lingers in whispers, in the rhythm of footsteps down Royal Street, in the hushed tones of guides pointing toward the cathedral's marble floor. The poisoned wedding became a story people told by candlelight. Dockworkers spoke of it in taverns as proof of how the wealthy despised the Irish. Creole widows used it as a warning to their daughters: marry below your station and you invite ruin. The clergy cited it in sermons as an example of pride curdling into sin. Yet beneath the moral lessons lay a deeper unease. If poison could be poured into a chalice, the vessel of Christ's blood, then what sanctuary was left untouched? What ritual remained safe? For many, faith itself seemed shaken, as though Margaret's hand had reached beyond her son's marriage to taint the sacred. Thomas's departure north left behind only echoes. He wrote letters to the Callahans for a time, sending money when he could. But grief hardened him. Those who knew him in New York described a man courteous yet distant, as if a portion of him had been buried with Mary. When asked of his family, he spoke only, "My mother is dead to me." Margaret's name, once spoken with respect in garden district salons, became a curse. Children whispered it when daring each other to step into darkened parlors. "Margaret Brown will fetch you," they hissed. Her prison file notes, her final years were spent in silence, staring at her hands as if still stained with phosphorus dust. Even today, some parishioners insist that on quiet mornings, when the cathedral is empty, one can smell faint smoke near the altar rail, not incense, but something acrid, metallic, like burned matches. The ** dismisses it as imagination. But the old women crossing themselves believe otherwise, that the poison never left, that the chalice still bears memory of fire. The tragedy endures because it was never only about murder. It was about the collision of worlds, the immigrant girl who dared to marry upward, the proud widow who could not allow it, the son trapped between love and legacy. A city divided by class, by bloodlines, by prejudice, became the stage for one family's ruin. And so the tale survives, not merely as scandal but as warning. Wealth may build ships and houses, but it cannot anchor the heart. Pride may guard a family name, but it cannot protect against decay. Love may defy society, yet still perish at the hand of those who claim to act out of love. When we stand before the cathedral today, tourists snapping photographs beneath its spires, the story waits beneath the stone, asking quietly whether families are destroyed more often by hatred of others, or by love twisted into possession. And you, reader, if you had been there on that March morning in 1852, when the chalice passed into Mary Callahan's trembling hands, would you have seen it? Would you have stopped her? Or would you, like the rest, have mistaken a mother's devotion for something sacred, until it was too late? The prison records state that Margaret Brown died in 1862, 10 years into her sentence. The cause was listed as fever of the lungs, though the warden's notes add a curious detail. In her final hours she begged for a chalice of water, whispering that her throat still burned. None was given. Her grave lies in an unmarked corner of Baton Rouge Penitentiary's cemetery, overgrown with weeds. Visitors to the site often report a strange gleam in the soil after rain, as if crystals glittered just beneath the surface. The groundskeepers dismiss it as mineral runoff. Others call it the echo of phosphorus, refusing to fade. In New Orleans, the legend grew. Lovers walking past the cathedral at dusk were warned not to linger, lest they hear the faint rattle of a cup striking stone. Children dared each other to press their lips to the altar rail, whispering the bride's final words. The wine burns. By the late 19th century, guidebooks to the city already listed the tale as folklore. But for families of Irish descent, it was remembered more bitterly, a symbol of how prejudice could kill as surely as poison. Thomas Brown's later life in New York ended quietly in 1884. His law office records show a modest practice, mostly cases defending immigrants accused of theft or brawling. In his final years, neighbors said he never attended weddings. "Too much joy unsettles him," one remarked. His last will left what little he owned to an orphanage on Mulberry Street, for the children who arrive with nothing. Thus the wedding tragedy passed into history, half legal record, half ghost story. And though the chalice itself was melted down in 1865, parishioners swear the memory remains. For some stains, once spilled, cannot be washed away.